So now, without further ado, we're here to celebrate Ruha Benjamin for her book, Viral Justice: How We Grow the World We Want. Ruha is an internationally recognized writer, speaker, and professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, where she is the founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. She is the award-winning author of Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, and editor of Captivating Technology, among other publications. Her work has been featured widely in the media, including New York Times, The Washington Post, CNN, The Root, and The Guardian. While her groundbreaking research on broad structural change around race, justice, and technology has won awards and been featured widely in the media, the twin plagues of COVID-19 and anti-Black violence prompted her to rethink the importance of small individual actions. Her resulting book, Viral Justice, is a sweeping and deeply personal exploration of how we can transform society through the choices we make every day. Joining Ruha in conversation tonight is Clint Smith, staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of How the World Is Past: A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller, and perhaps even more impressively, a consistent bestseller and customer favorite here at PMP since its release last June. And might I add, a personal favorite of mine. So now please join me in welcoming Ruha Benjamin and Clint Smith.
Hello, hello. How's everybody doing? Thank you so much for coming out to celebrate and talk about and learn more about this brilliant book from this brilliant writer, thinker, and professor. The first time I met Ruha, I was a very nervous graduate student at a conference. She reminded me, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. And she was kind of sitting in the corner while other presentations were going on. And I tapped my fellow grad student on the shoulder. I was like, I think that's Ruha Benjamin. And he was like, that. And she was like a star. She's like, it's like, you know, when you're at when you're a grad student and you see these professors who have quite literally made the work that you do possible and laid the sort of groundwork for your ideas. It's you get starstruck. And so I was very excited to meet her. She was nothing but generous, nothing but kind, and I think has been a model. Any person I talk to who knows Ruha, who is engaged with her, who's taken her class, who has been her colleague, one of the first things they talk about is her generosity, her empathy, and her kindness, which doesn't always exist in academia in the ways that we would hope. And so when you have someone, especially to junior scholars and to younger graduate students, who extends that level of warmth and kindness, it's really special. And so I'm very excited to now, 4 or 5 years later, be here sitting alongside her to be able to discuss this incredible book and to be able to do it in person, because there's nothing like the sort of smell of pages in a bookstore and seeing all of your faces, as convenient as being online was for, you know, being in your pajamas and your slippers.
Clint's check is in the mail for all.
Could you start by telling us a little bit about the title and what you mean by viral justice and what that framework sort of represents?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. So viral justice, the initial title for this book when I first started working on it in spring 2020 was Viral Racism, because I was trying to reckon with both what was happening in terms of public health and what was happening in terms of the more obvious forms of police brutality and violence that were streaming, and trying to connect the dots. And right away, a voice came into my head, one of a former mentor, who in a previous project encouraged me to think about, as academics, how often we astutely name the things that we don't want, critique the world as it is. And he encouraged me in that project to consider giving voice to and naming the things we want more of, the things we want to grow, the processes, the relationships. And so that voice came back into my head, and I shifted gears and thought about this notion of viral justice and how we can learn from this virus, this microscopic entity that has brought the world in many ways to its knees, how we transmit it through our everyday actions, habits. And I thought, what if we could channel that microscopic power or energy in the other direction, in a more life-affirming way? And so this concept it's not a new academic theory, it's a lens so that we can see all of the small ways that people already are and that people can engender more justice and joy in the world as individuals, organizations, movements. And so in a nutshell, it's a micro vision of change. And it's training our attention to those things that might not get the headlines and the hot takes, that don't necessarily show up in our policies and our laws, that are not kind of top-down things that happen, but are ground up, that are things that we see around us every day. Because as my grandma said, and as I quote in the intro, what we want more of, we should water. And so with this naming and with the stories that I'm telling, I'm trying to encourage us to water these things that are really giving us life that sometimes we don't acknowledge as much.
And thinking about the way that viral justice is a sort of lens, as you put it, to sort of better understand this moment, to better understand the manifestations of the virus, of anti-Blackness, the sort of confluence of them. You also provide us with a lens through which to understand your own life, right? So part of this book that I wasn't necessarily anticipating when I opened it is that it in many ways, it feels like it has many strains of a memoir. There's stories of your family, of your children, of your brother, of you and your experience with childbirth. These like very personal, very often vulnerable stories. And I'm curious if that was always the plan, like if when you began thinking about this idea, if you imagined it as being sort of purely external facing project, and if that changed over the course of it, or if you always imagined threading your own life through.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think from the very beginning, there was a commitment, I had a commitment to using stories to ground the larger ideas or concepts. And the stories I know best are the ones in my own life and family and friendships. And so in the very first draft, in like April 2020, the first line of the book as we have it here was that first line that I wrote, which was, I grew up in the White House. And so with that beginning, it was kind of excavating all of the things that made me, for better or worse. And I think what motivated me to write in this way is that I'm asking the reader to think about their own lives, to think about their own connections. And so I want to meet you halfway. If I'm asking you to do this internal work, then I felt I have to also model it. I have to also go into those vulnerable spaces to invite you to do the same thing in your own way. And so I think from the beginning, it was always trying to take the personal seriously and connect it to my public commitments.
Got it. And, so part of it is that this book is grounded in research, it's grounded in stories from your own life, and it's also grounded in sort of small profiles of people, of organizations, of nonprofits, of communities that are sort of exemplars in some ways of this version of the world that we, as you kind of alluded to before, are aspiring toward, right? And so it's not just saying, we should do more of this, or we should do more of that. It's actually saying, look at this group in this city doing this. Look at this group in this community doing this. And I'm wondering, were these all organizations or people that you were familiar with at the beginning? Like, did you know all about them all before, or did you come across them through the process? Did you have individual relationships with them?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. Like a lot of the organizations and individuals I knew of, but perhaps just knew in a superficial way. Like I knew they were doing good work in this place, or I knew a friend who worked in this place. But to actually tell the story, I had to go beyond the kind of brochure or the mission statement on their websites and dig a little deeper. There were places where I'm talking about some issue or problem that's plaguing us, and where I start getting really sort of drawn into the problem space again. And so there were moments where my editor had to be like, okay, so who's working on this? Who can we point to that's addressing this or fighting this or giving us an alternative. And so there were, in conversation with my editors and early readers, moments where I had to be prompted to look beyond my own frame of reference and who I knew to find examples of individuals or groups that were on the front lines doing something. And so, there's a big mix of people and groups in there that we could talk about.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would love to hear, are there one or two that were particularly compelling, and could you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer the, is there a favorite one? Because it's like, which son do I love more? But I'll give you one from the beginning and then the one from the end. They kind of bookend in different ways. So I start, again, the book where I grew up in the White House in South LA. It was called the White House because my grandparents' last name was the Whites, and so they put a plaque on the front to let everybody know this is the real White House. And in that same neighborhood, one of the individuals that I would learn about later, who in 2010, I believe, was noticing what some people call food deserts, but essentially he was seeing that it was really tough to find fresh fruits and vegetables in that neighborhood readily. And at the same time, he was noticing that dialysis clinics were popping up as frequently as Starbucks. And so he was grappling with this environment and this context. And he decided, he looked out, his front door, and in LA, throughout Los Angeles, there are these patches of grass between the sidewalk and the street that are called parkways. They're not very big. And some people keep them up, some people ignore them. But he thought, what if I could create edible gardens right there in front of my yard? And this man, Ron Finley, is otherwise known as the Gangster Gardener. And so he decided, let me just try planting some food in the parkway. And lo and behold, not surprising to many people who know what our criminal legal system is all about, he was issued a warrant for his arrest for planting this edible garden. And his supporters and he rallied together. They had that overturned, and then they just started planting these edible gardens all around LA, 10, 20. Now there's a teaching garden so that to teach people of all ages organic farming. And his neighbors who were, food insecure were shocked that they could just walk past his house and grab food without anyone saying anything. And so here we see this model where we take this idea of growing the world we want quite literally. It's not a metaphor anymore. It's just getting our hands dirty right where we are, not waiting for someone to give us permission to start to address the problem that we want to solve. He says, food was the problem, food is the solution. But he also talks about how this is about the practical aspect of eating, but it's also about beauty. It's about making our environments more beautiful and how that starts to affect us. And so there's a lot that I write about his own story and motivations. But to me, I start early in the book offering that up because it spread. People were attracted to that. More people got involved. Now people bring their students there on the weekends. And so this idea of making justice contagious or making a certain change contagious so it spreads. On the other end of the book, towards the very end, I share an example from Seattle, where very different example that arose during the 2020 protests, where all of these different organizations in the city that were working on many different issues, again, from housing rights, food sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty, education, over 200 local organizations band together. And they decided that the city budget did not reflect their collective values in terms of where the resource sources were going. They, for example, pointed out that the police get 26 times more than anything going to climate justice. One of many examples of this deep, deadly asymmetry. And so they worked together. They had Zoom town halls. They had teach-ins. And over the last 2 years, they've managed to reallocate funds away from policing to the things that we actually need to sustain us in terms of housing, education, childcare, energy, And so this is an example where they tell us that a budget, something that is easy to overlook. Most of us don't know what's in our city budget, right? an Excel sheet. They say, look at the small print. The small print tells us what our values are. So they say a budget is not just a budget, it's a moral document, which I think is really powerful reframing. To think about just these numbers in this Excel sheet, that's a moral document because it's telling us what we value as a community. And they've worked together and have successfully started to shift the values, literally the economic values, as they reflect the social values in a direction that is life-affirming. And so again, two very different examples, and there are many more alike that just give us a reminder that besides what we get in our news feeds and the media, that everything is doom and gloom, there are people working, experimenting, practicing a different way of being together.
Speaking of numbers, one of the sections of your book that I thought was most interesting was where you're sort of wrestling with the idea or the purpose of research. And as a graduate student in the social sciences, I think this is something that I've spent many years and continue to think a lot about in my current life. And so, part of what the tension is, and you name this in the book, is that sometimes, I think you call it the datafication of justice. And sometimes you suggest that we are always waiting for like the next report or the next white paper or the next article or the next thing that is going to prove a thing that sort of empirically proves something that many people experience and know in their bodies, in their hearts, in their communities already. And so there's that. And then I'm also thinking about there was a Stanford study a few years ago, and I remember that it was a study that showed that the black people are disproportionately sentenced.
Yeah, I can share that.
Yeah.
So that study came to mind when you brought this datafication of injustice. And again, there I'm wrestling kind of with my roots, like spending 4 years in undergrad, 6 years in college, 2 years in postdoc. Like, we're invested in this enlightenment model of change. Like, if people would just understand the facts, right? Raising awareness that is the thing that is really going to shift us. And so more recently, I tell myself, I tell my students that the facts alone aren't going to save us. And this Stanford study is really illustrative because what the researchers did was they approached white Americans in California and New York, and they showed them the data that shows that black people are being warehoused in our jails and prisons at a much higher rate than other groups. And then they said, now that you see this disparity data, we can call it, are you willing to support reforms to the policies that have helped to create those disparities? In California, the 3 strikes law. In New York, the stop and frisk policy. And the researchers were surprised that the more that people were exposed to the data, the less likely they were to want to support the reforms. And so again, Enlightenment model tells us that people are drawing the same conclusions that we are, and rather, I think, like, I imagine this scenario and I think, what is all of the stuff in between here and the data? Like this space right here. And so we can call it interpretive frames, we can call it cultural narratives, we can call it straight up lies that people tell themselves to help justify why those people deserve to be in those cages. So if I think that, why would I support policies to change that? This is a crimogenic community. It's their culture, you know, or it's their genetics. What all of the different interpretive lies that help to make sense of that reinforce the status quo. So for me, there are many ways to sit with that and to think about what are the take-homes, but one of them is that we have to care as much about the stories as we do the statistics. Just throwing statistics around, including COVID statistics. We saw that in the early months, showing that our communities were dying at higher rates. And what did that do? That didn't lead people to be more sympathetic. That didn't lead people to support policies that would begin to address those disparities. It created more division. It created more sort of distance, where people said, let them die. Our eugenics roots kicked in. You know, if you're not surviving, that means you're not fit. And so again, we can't rely solely on stats or data as, you know, the main sort of awareness raising sort of strategy. We have to think about a lot of other things, one of which I'm suggesting are these kind of cultural narratives and stories that people will tell whether or not the researchers present them or not.
So how do you, and as you said, like this is something we could go on and on about, but I am curious, I just want to stay on this a second. Like you're a social scientist, right? You're a professor, a tenured professor who's made a life of thinking about some of this data and some of these empirical evidence and some of these ideas. And so what is it, and we are also the sort of part of the lineage, part of like a Du Boisian lineage, right? In which Du Bois in some ways was wrestling with the same things that we were, right? He was like, if I just write the Philadelphia Negro, if I just write this book, if I just write this article, if I just write that, and came to recognize himself that in and of itself was not going to do the work that he, I think, imagined it would at the beginning of his career. And yet, those documents are still incredibly valuable, right? Those books are still incredibly valuable. So how do we hold a recognition of the limitations, and not even the limitations, but as we've talked about, the sort of maybe unintended consequences of research that we might do, with a recognition that the research is still, there's still value in research. And how do you hold those at once?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I think I love that you brought in Du Bois, because when we look at the arc of his life, going from this hardcore scientist, he probably didn't even put the social in front of. He's like, I'm a scientist, to really, as the arc goes, becoming more and more invested in the arts, in poetry, in storytelling, in science fiction, and playwriting. And so for me, that part of the answer is that we and I try to find a way to weave together the critical, sort of scientific understanding that we need to dissect, and we need to look at what's plaguing us, using all the tools at our disposal, not just quantitative. But to me, that has to go hand in hand with a creative mode of knowledge production and engagement. So for example, in the Just Data Lab that they mentioned, part of what we try to do is, first of all, the students that work in that lab aren't simply those coming from computer science or quantitative background. We have humanists, we have historians, and we have artists, and we have filmmakers, because there's an understanding that we are responsible for the stories that go along with this data. We can't leave it to other people to tell the stories, because then those lies are going to kick in. And so we see it as part and parcel of the knowledge production to also care narrative, and to not just care about it, but to craft it ourselves, not wait for other people's framings of what we're producing to kick in. So the shorthand is that the critical and the creative go hand in hand. One without the other, I think, can, and it's not that one person or one group has to do everything, but we have to value both, and collaborate in important ways.
Another part of the book that I was really fascinated by was when you talk about, like, you talk a lot about the work that organizers and activists are doing, and I wonder, there's a part where you talk about how now in organizing spaces, there is a primacy that has been placed on rest, and self-care in ways that had not maybe previously been. And I'm thinking about this, and I'm also thinking about, I was on a panel with our colleague Derica Purnell last week at Howard, and one of the things that she was talking about is that she's incredibly happy that more activists and organizers are recognizing they need to take care of themselves, and that sometimes you don't have to go 100 miles an hour all the time. And she's also concerned that a younger generation of activists and organizers are thinking about individual rest at the expense of collective resistance. And so I'm curious how you think about that. I thought it was interesting because she was like, if we focus so much, almost like the pendulum is swinging, yes, and it was like all the way over here, and now it's back here, and she's like, well, there needs to be some sort of equilibrium. And I'm curious, because obviously you're deeply integrated in and spend a lot of time in these spaces, how you think about what that equilibrium is.
Yes, and I love Derica, and I also love a book that Pub dropped yesterday as well, Rest is Resistance, by Tricia Hershey, who I cite in Viral Justice.
The NAP Ministry.
Yes, the NAP Ministry. And so, yeah, it's this idea that, there is a consumer model of self-care that we can buy our way to rest if we just get the right manicure, the right massage, the right spa. And all of that can have its place. But what I hear also Derica saying is for us to think carefully about what we're being sold as the antidote to burnout, and to craft our own, to think about what collective forms of care look like, so that it might not be a day at the spa, but a day on the grass with friends, commiserating and sharing and being together. And so thinking about what those collective moments are. But I think going back to what you said about an earlier generation, what I love about the shift, and I tweeted this a few weeks ago when my students found out that I was going to be on the road, invariably, one after the other in different contexts, their first response to me was, how are you going to have fun? How are you going to relax? When you get back, are you, like, they weren't like, go, professor, like cheering me on like the grind. They were like, make sure that you're balanced, And to me, that was so telling, that they were not fetishizing overwork and grind and, assuming that the hustle is, a kind of certain status with. And so even now, like with them in my ear, when people preface any kind of invitation, oh, I know you're so busy. And I'm like, my busy is not any more special than your busy. Like, there's certain people's busy who gets to be, kind of like honored and respected. So I think for me, the point, though, with what I love about it, and it goes back to an underlying current of the book, is that we can't wait for permission, and we can't wait for everything to change to start changing in the here and now. This idea of prefiguring the world that we want. That means whatever we want for the future, can we find ways to begin to practice it, even in small ways now? Because that is the arc to what we want. And so if we believe that people should not be working themselves to death in some, idealized future, then maybe we can start figuring out how to engender that, not just through individual action. And I think that's where Derica comes in. But what are the policies? What are the practices that would enable that, so it doesn't just become something for the privileged to enjoy, but something that the so-called essential workers on whom we relied so heavily through the last 2.5 years. And so again, I think it's that balance is to not sort of look for ways to buy ourselves into this rest, but to think about how everyone can enjoy it and engender it.
Which is in and of itself a sort of needing to recognize the way that capitalism will make you think that certain things constitute as rest, or that the only way to rest involves for sort of further entrenching yourself in consumerism, which I think part of what so many of these community organizations and spaces that you're in conversation with in your work and in your life are doing are sort of rejecting the very premise, right? Yes. And saying that part of what rest looks like is in community. Yes. With each other, right? Part of what rest is, and that notions of rest, and just as Trisha's work illuminates, the notions of like what constitutes as rest and resistance aren't mutually exclusive.
Yes. Can I give you a quick example that's not in the book that just happened a month ago? One of the students from my lab spent the summer working with a community organization in Chicago, and they were building a campaign against shot spotter technology, which are being adopted by law enforcement around the country to detect gunshots before they actually happen. And so it's one of these predictive tools that fall into what I've called elsewhere the new Jim Code. So she was there working with this organization, but one of the things they realized first, most people, everyday people, haven't heard of this. And we can't assume what their ideas about it would be, even if they have heard about it. So their approach was to build relationships. And the first workshop they had wasn't a teach-in about ShotSpotter, jumping straight to like the facts about this new technology. What they held was a community joy festival. And they had dancing and piñatas and music. And they had backpacks for the kids to go back to school, and winter jackets and pencils and pens. And so it was more about getting to know and celebrating life before we talk about this thing that's trying to kill us. And so again, it's thinking about, not jumping over that and understanding the role of play and joy in any kind of movement building.
Which is so important, I think, because I think so many folks whose lives are, who commit their lives to this sort of work, I think sometimes folks can forget and I think this is changing as we've talked about, but I think historically some people have not been able to enjoy themselves the very world that they are trying to create for others, right? And so it's like, if we want, you want people to have a living wage, you want people to have healthcare, you want people to have access to good housing, you want people to have access to all of these things, and all of those are in service of making it so that people can live a life full of meaning and purpose that exists beyond the context of their work. And sometimes people, I think, feel as if they need to become martyrs, deprive themselves of the very thing they're trying to give to others. Yeah.
Yes. And so we just have to go back to like our Black feminist genealogy, where essentially the wisdom is that we need to make what we're doing irresistible, so there's a sense of draw to it, not just a sort of intellectual investment in it.